The video kind of explains what this is, what CRM is in a bit more detail. But before we can really understand what the management systems are, we also need to understand what the climate risk assessment is, which is part of the whole CRM kind of methodology. So as you can see, I'll share some of the resources like the video that was being played. This is all obviously done by GIZ, but these are really good resources for you guys to have. So I'll definitely share them with Medea and the team, and then they can forward it to you. So the climate risk assessment is a 6-step methodology. So first we, as it says, do the analysis of the status quo. So that is basically what the reality of the situation is, not how you want to shape the realities. So this can be done through monitoring and evaluation, research and development, things like that. Then you have to also kind of do an analysis of what certain hotspots for your assessment are. So for instance, if you are a company that is working on, solar panels or something like that, right? You have to analyze like what are the risks associated with that. So for instance, as we know, in Pakistan, a lot of taxation goes up and down when it comes to renewable energy. Sometimes the tariff is levied, sometimes it's taken off. So that really impacts how renewable energy is scaled up in the country. So that's a hotspot, right? So then we do development of context-specific methodological approach, which is kind of like a worst-case scenario of what could possibly go wrong, and you kind of try to do some kind of planning around that. So that also comes into the climate adaptation kind of policy. Then qualitative and quantitative risk assessment. So this means not only the numbers that will be impacted. So numbers means like your customer base, that could be affected, but also the quality. So that could be two ways. Your customer quality could also go down. So for instance, if you have international and local customers, that could be also one of the factors, but it could also be the quality of your product could also go down, right? So the quality that you're providing your customer, that could also go down. Then evaluation of risk tolerance. So risk tolerance is also done by monitoring and evaluation. And you have to basically build this kind of, you kind of go back to the hotspot analysis, and you have to kind of understand that how well would your product or service actually stand in the face of that risk if it happened. Then lastly, it's the identification of feasible options in that case. So kind of like a plan B in case all else fails, right? Also, one thing I wanted to point out is that climate risk management can mean two things. So a lot of the times the way it's framed is that your business is identifying the risks you might face in the case of a climate emergency, right? But a lot of the times how we don't think about it, and the way we should think about it, is that is your company posing any risk to the environment? So that's also a risk, right? Because you want to be part of the solution. You don't want to make the problem worse. And when we think about this, I think it is a bit of a complex issue, because there's lots of, because, we are trying to transition into the clean energy, clean economy, but that isn't very straightforward, actually. Just because something is clean energy or green does not mean it's, without risk for the planet. Maybe it will fall somewhere in the moderate or maybe in the high, because the problem is that electric vehicles are still reliant on electricity, which, as you know, comes from fossil fuels mostly. And then in Pakistan, electric vehicles, because we have such an energy crisis, so then, how will we do this transition to electric vehicles, even though it's a very hot market in Pakistan right now? I'd like to just discuss a little bit this article I wrote a couple of years back on electric vehicles to give you a bit of a context as well. So this was a research article I did for this German foundation called Heinrich Böll Stiftung. And basically, I took the mining that has been happening in the Arctic for the first time. because there is such a high demand of electric vehicles in Scandinavia, that there is, for the first time, this copper mining happening over there, which is really, really bad for the indigenous communities there, and it's causing a really bad carbon footprint. So see, this is what I'm trying to say, that just because something is green doesn't necessarily mean it is good for the environment. So in case, I can share this article if anyone wants to read it. But yeah, let's move on. So yeah, so I also wanted to go into what really is a carbon footprint. Like, we hear this all the time. It's pretty simple, actually. It's, I'm sure all of you know, it's, like how much your greenhouse gases emissions are, as an individual, as a country, as a company. But, there is a lot of, one thing I will say, there's a lot of, and I think we all grew up with this. I think maybe you're all born 80s, 90s. I was born in 89. So I really grew up with this idea and this branding and this marketing that, reuse, reduce, recycle, and that, we as individuals can really make a difference within the environment. That is not true. Even if we all stopped eating meat and didn't buy anything, it would make a difference. But it is the companies and the governments that are mostly, especially the private sector, that is making the most emissions. And obviously the big high polluting countries like the United States, actually India and China, especially China, is getting quite up there, and India might in the next few years be a very high emitter as well, despite its post-colonial status. So that is something to consider. But I think for your companies, these tools that calculate carbon footprints and emissions is really beneficial. So these are some resources, and the one I use personally for work is the USAID one and the RET screen. It's a bit complicated in the beginning, but you get a hang of it. I have no training in, I'm really bad at math and all these things, but if I can do it, I'm sure all of you can learn to do it as well. It's not that, it looks more complicated than it is. So I also wanted to go a little bit into kind of connecting carbon footprint with utilizing sustainability models. So what really is sustainable development? I do think it's, even though it's like a catch-all kind of phrase, it's a little bit of a, I think in today's times, it's a contradictory statement. Sustainable development, I think the fact that we think development can be sustainable is actually, I think, something that is showing that it's not really true. There's also this model called degrowth, which is a very radical thinking that for actual sustainability and the planet to actually, for humans on the planet to have survival, we actually need to go into something that's called degrowth, which doesn't mean we stop expanding our economy. So sustainable development, just to say some of these lines on here, it says, meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Sustainability is a possibility that human and other forms of life on Earth will flourish forever. And then sustainable development is enough for all forever. So basically it's, don't take more than you need. So that's basically, I think, the crux of all of these definitions. So then when we talk about sustainable development, there's a couple of pillars, as we call them. So there's three: there's social, economic, and environmental, as you might have guessed. And this is a bit of old school thinking, but it was called the prism of sustainable development. But it's, used a lot now as well. And the four pillars are, or four dimensions, I would say. So there's the economic dimension, that is, of course, what man-made capital, like buildings, companies, all these things, roads, infrastructure. Environmental dimension is the capital, is the natural capitals of the natural world, forests, mangroves, things like that. Then we have the social dimension, which is the human capital, which is, of course, humans, and then that's based for institutional. So that's systemic and structural. So what we mean by systemic and structural is that they can either act as, I would say, barriers to being more sustainable, or they can be vessels and vehicles for sustainability. If you think of, so a prism basically has different sides. And when we talk about these 4 dimensions, we're basically, okay, if you think of it as layering, right? So we first think about the environmental dimension, right? So imagine if we were not on the planet, right? And it was just like a natural world. And then we kind of then start building upon another world that humans have created. That's another dimension, right? And how did humans do that is through a social dimension and institutions, right? So we created schools, we created churches and mosques, and we created, like this whole like institutional framework that allowed us to have this kind of development and progress and economy in the world, right? So the way these 3 things, institutional, we kind of put in the social. So the way these 3 interact with each other is how we build models. So as I'll go into a bit more detail in the next slides, there's different ways you can merge these 3 together, and that kind of identifies how sustainable your model actually is. So let me go ahead and then maybe that'll get more clear.